I'm Josh Reynolds. I'm going to be talking about porting your iPad app to the Mac using Catalyst. This is kind of a combination of things that I've learned actually using Catalyst. And so we're going to go over a couple different kinds of things, like using it and concepts, and also design of like how a Mac app is, ways that a Mac app is different than an iPad app. All right, so that's what we're going to go over. We're going to go over basics, similarities, differences. Some APIs that are actually new. It does let you share most of your code, but there's some new things as well. And then also how to distribute your app when you've finished making it. So the first step for using Catalyst is this shiny new Mac checkbox. You can check that in your Xcode preferences for your app, but just checking that is probably not going to be enough to get your app to work. If you've got a pretty simple app, maybe just checking it will work. If not, it's probably not even going to run. And there's a couple reasons for that. And so I'll go over the basics, and you'll see why some of those things, what might cause it to not run. So kind of the basic way that Catalyst works is that it shares a lot of the frameworks that are built into iOS with your Mac. So a lot of frameworks that are really basic underlying frameworks like Foundation, they're mostly the same across iOS and Mac. But a lot of other ones, there's two different versions of those frameworks. So if you're importing WebKit or MapKit or something, there's actually separate versions of those for Mac and iOS, where you might still have something like a WK web view in each one, but the actual definitions of those classes are different, because in UIKit, you get web views are subclasses of UI view, but on the Mac, they're subclasses of NS view instead. So a lot of the things work pretty similarly, but at the same time, they're different. And Xcode will just figure out which one for you to use. So when you're on the Mac, they'll use all of their Mac versions of those. But in some cases, some things might be a little different. And certain frameworks aren't even supported at all. If it doesn't make sense to be on a Mac, it probably just doesn't exist. One specific example is things like ARKit. Like, you're not really doing AR or like having the sensors. Like, if the Mac doesn't have the physical sensors for those, the API for them probably doesn't even exist, even if you can import the right thing for them. And anything that's deprecated is probably just not included at all. So if you're using anything that's deprecated, it just won't compile. And anything that's precompiled also won't work, because it's probably compiled for the wrong, it's not going to work. So if you have something that is precompiled, you're going to need to get it and wait for a new version if you're not the one who wrote it. A big example of that is Google Firebase. So if you have Firebase in your app, parts of it might work, but other big parts probably won't. So like in my case, for my app that I was working on, I just had to completely remove it. And there were some parts that I was relying on, so I had to do a little bit of work to figure out how to get those things to mostly work without Firebase. But if you have certain frameworks that you want to exclude, you can do that. So there's this new platforms setting for each one of your libraries or frameworks that you're importing, and you can choose for each one whether you want it to use it on Mac and iOS, which is the default, or you can limit them to just iOS. Or if you're giving your Mac version of your app some specific things, you can make it macOS exclusive. And on a specific code level, you can use target environment Mac Catalyst to include or exclude certain parts of your code, or just do things differently, or use certain APIs that only exist on one platform. And then about how you should actually build your app. Apple says that they want you to make an app that is an iPad app on the inside, but a Mac app on the outside. So that means you should keep building your app as if it were an iPad app and using all of the same patterns and everything that you're used to using to make an iPad app. But the goal of Catalyst is to make that appear as if it's a Mac app and feel more Mac-like. One other thing that Catalyst will do is that it actually creates a separate bundle identifier for you. So your Mac version of your app has Mac Catalyst added to the beginning of it, and you can't change that. So if you have any code that relies on your bundle identifier, you need to think about how to make that work with this prefix instead. And the last part of this is that there are some extensions that you can actually use with Catalyst, but many that you can't. And these are the list of allowed extensions that you can make. If you make like a share extension, it'll just show up across other apps on the Mac right alongside the native AppKit ones, which is pretty cool, but these are the only ones that are allowed. So if you've got other things like today extensions or widgets, they won't work. And that's actually one of the limitations. If you have something like a today extension, you would have to write a Mac version using AppKit if you want to have a widget that lives inside Notification Center on the Mac. But those can actually only be contained right now within AppKit apps. So if you're using Catalyst, you just can't have you can't have a widget right now. So Catalyst is really great because it does a lot of things for you, and it really does a lot of work to make your app feel more Mac-like, and they give you a lot more options of things you can do. But it still kind of feels like it's still kind of being worked on, and some parts of it could definitely be improved. But it does give you a lot for you. So one of the big differences is that Mac apps kind of are fundamentally different from iPad apps. Mac apps, they have the same kind of concept of a frontmost application as an iPad, but it means something different. On an iPad, you're really only looking at one app at a time. Even if you support multiple windows on iOS 13, you're still really only looking at one thing at a time, maybe two side by side, but an app could be in the background, but that has a different meaning on the Mac than it does on iOS. Mac apps that are in the background, if the app is still open, then the system assumes that the user is still doing something with that app. So there's no limitation on CPU or memory, and they won't be killed by the system. So in order to keep this same kind of, in order to let you keep the way that you've already architected your app, Mac OS apps always stay in the foreground and active, even if they're not actively being used. And it's still a little bit different. So before they do get killed, they'll go inactive, and your apps can still wake up in the background to do background work. Okay, so you actually get a lot of things for free just by checking that box. So one thing is you get a menu bar, and that's completely new for Catalyst because you can't have menu bars in iPad apps. And they give you a lot of options in the menu bar by default, like copy and paste, all the things that you're used to. You get windows that can be resized. So you need to make sure that your code for auto layout is fast because it's going to be called a lot as you are dragging to resize the window. You get support for dark mode. You get scroll bars that respect the system preferences for whether they're there all the time or hidden, depending on if they're using a mouse. You even get a preferences window. So on iOS, if you're using a preferences bundle to have your settings appear in the settings app, the Mac app will automatically get, for free, this little preferences menu that will show up. And you don't have to do anything for that. It'll just show up. You get the native support for the touch bar on MacBooks that have touch bar. So anytime you're entering text, you get a nice text entry. And they also provide you APIs to the same APIs that are available to AppKit to let you write your own touch bar support. And it's actually pretty easy. You get an open and save panel. So if you're using the UI document picker view controller, when you present it, it'll just show a native Mac file picker. Although, along with that is one of those bugs that I found with Catalyst. The delegate for the UI document picker view controller has one method that gets called when the user picks a file, and one method that gets called when the user cancels. And from what I've found, even if you pick a file, it will always call the cancel method. So you can't pick a file with it. I found some other people online who have had the same problem, and we can't seem to figure out what's wrong. So Catalyst just seems to have some kinds of bugs like that. But it still does get you most of the way towards a Mac app, which is pretty cool. So one other big difference is 77% scaling. So this one seems a little weird, but that's because the text size is different between iOS and macOS. And iOS has dynamic type so that you can change the default size of text, but macOS actually doesn't have a dynamic type setting. And the default text size on macOS is 13 point, but it's 17 point on iOS. So if your apps ran at the same scale, everything would feel a lot bigger. So because of that, everything that you render will be scaled down by 77% automatically. So that's something you may have to consider if you're working with, or if you're just not expecting it. So here are, most of the APIs have identical behavior between macOS and iOS. That's kind of the point, is that you can share almost all of your code between macOS and iOS. And like I said before, some things map to macOS functionality, like the open and save panels. If you try to present a Safari view controller, instead it'll just open Safari. And clicks correspond to touches. And you can even use gestures if you're using a trackpad. And the way that that works is that it'll simulate touches and deliver them to the view that is underneath the cursor. So if you've got multiple gesture recognizers on things, you can just choose, the user gets to choose which thing they're zooming in on or rotating based off of where the cursor is. And there's even a new UI hover gesture recognizer that works just the same as all the other gesture recognizers, but it reacts to the user hovering over something with the mouse cursor. And that is kind of shows the way that Catalyst is meant to be used a little bit. If you look at UI hover gesture recognizer, it's actually available on iOS and iPadOS also, but it just doesn't do anything, and it's never triggered. So you don't have to write your code any different or even use that target environment check, because you can just add a hover gesture recognizer to things that you want to react to being hovered on if you have like a link or something, and it'll work on Mac. And that situation probably won't come up on iOS. So how do you make an actual good Mac app? So if you support all of the things that make an iPad app better, you'll get a better Mac app, especially some of the new features in iOS 13. This one isn't from iOS 13, but if you use drag and drop, that'll make your app really feel at home, especially more so on iPad. People expect to be able to just drag and drop things. So it's really important to support this more so than on iPad, where people may not be as used to it. For example, in the app that I'm working on, I've got a spot where you can drag an image into an image view to set an image on something. And I had already supported that, so I didn't have to do any extra work. I could just drag an image file from my desktop onto that image view, and it supplied the right image. And it was pretty cool that it just worked without me having to do any extra different code to do it. It works with dark mode on iOS or on Mac OS. So if the user set their system to dark mode, it's the same as iOS 13. But another thing that you probably want to support is the new UI window scene and UI scene session APIs to support multiple windows. You can have your app work as just one window, like most iPad apps probably do still, but it feels a little bit out of place on a Mac app. I mean, there are some Mac apps that can have just one window, but in some cases, it can really make it feel like you're just clicking through an iPad app, which is probably not what you want. Catalyst really does get you most of the way there to a Mac app, so most of your work on it will just be putting in these specific Mac OS features. If you use the window scene and scene session APIs, you can pretty easily take a lot of things that a lot of view controllers that may have been presented before as a form sheet or just something presented in front of it, can now just be a separate window that can be dragged around. And it just feels that extra little bit more Mac-like with very little effort. And the last thing is you can set a custom app icon. And that's another thing that really makes it feel more Mac-like. by default, it'll just use your iPad app icon. So you'll get a little rounded square on your dock, which looks a little bit out of place because Mac apps have transparent backgrounds for their icons and unique shapes. So the way that you can do that is pretty easy. There's a new checkbox here next to the iPhone and iPad boxes. So you can just add Mac support and drop in the images in your asset catalog for a new icon. So you can make sidebars pretty easily too. So sidebars are accomplished with the new properties on split view controller. If you're already using your split view controller for something like this, all you need to do is set the new primary background style on your split view controller to the sidebar choice. And it will add this nice blur effect to the background that matches the rest of the Mac sidebars, like in Finder. And even more than that, if you're using a table view as that primary view controller with an inset grouped or grouped style, it'll even look just like it does in this picture, like the Mac Finder sidebars. And the last little extra bit that's nice is they have these other two new split view controller properties for minimum primary column width and maximum primary column width. And if you set them, it'll actually let you click and drag to resize that sidebar. Okay, so one thing that's completely new to macOS is menus. So at first, I was actually a little bit surprised about how the menus were working, because to me, it felt a little bit different from the way I'm used to things working on macOS. And we'll talk about something later, about something else that felt different in a pretty similar way. The difference is that for menus, what you want to do when you're designing your menu is you want to think about all of the possible things that the user can do in your application that you want them to be able to do through a menu. Because putting all of those things in the menu one time when you build your app lets the user look through the menus and figure out what kinds of things they can do in their app. You don't want the menus to be dynamic where things in them change depending on their context. So you can see here how when this file is selected, cut, copy, and paste are available, but when they're not, they're just grayed out. They're not missing from the list. So you really need to go through and catalog all of the things that the user can do in your app and put them into the menu in advance. And the way that you actually do those menus is you can use UI key commands or just UI commands. And if you use key commands, that's the same API that's available already on iPad and iPhone to use keyboard shortcuts. So it's pretty easy to build the menu. But because it's a little bit different and it's not actually building those menus isn't something that exists on iOS already, I'm going to walk through a little bit of how to do it. So one way you can do it is just through the storyboard. You can drag a menu bar right out into your storyboard, and then you can select all of these different menu items and delete them or add them and hook them up to IB actions. So it's pretty easy to get those things to work. But if you want to do it through code, this is what it will look like. So UI Responder has this new method called build menu, and you want to override it on your app delegate. And inside of this, they'll pass you a menu builder, which you can use to remove or add menus, commands, and submenus. So the first thing that I'm doing, this is an example from my app, is that I'm going through and removing all of the menu bar items that I'm not using. I don't have anywhere in my app where the user needs to edit rich text, so I can totally remove the format option since it's not useful. And then I can create a UI menu and give it a list of commands that are inside of it and insert them. You can use insert child to put a menu in as a submenu, and you can use insert sibling to put a menu right next to something else. And where I'm using this build menu.format, that's a menu identifier, and the code completion is just going to help you there because you can just type a dot and see all the menus that you can remove or all the placements of where you can put things. It's just all there. So one other little, if you want to be like a little more, to give the user a little more like information about how things are looking, you can validate those menu items. And that is what puts this little check mark. So this code up here is going to this is our goal, the picture on the right. And I'm going to walk through how to make that. So in this view, you can sort a list of items either by date or by name, and the current selected sort method is going to get the check mark. So we start off with, I made an enum with the cases for all the possible values. And then we create the menu. This is the menu that is the sort by menu that you can see selected here in the picture. And this is the menu that gets added with the menu builder. So in this menu, I map through all of the cases of that sort mode enum and turn them into UI commands. The title, I just use the title of the name of that case. An action, I'm going to use a function that I'm going to show next to show what happens when you click on it. And then you can give it a property list. So that command can know a little bit extra bit of information about itself that you can use later to validate or perform the action. So here's what happens when you try to select that action. So first, we look at the command, which is going to be the sender, and get out its property list that we set earlier. Then I'm going to take the value that I saved in that property list to go back to making a sort mode enum. And then in the closure at the end of this, I'm going to actually do the work of setting that sort mode. I cut out some of the stuff that's actually doing, but that's what it needs to do. So the property list is the key for how you actually know which thing was chosen here. And if you have different commands, you can do them in different sectors. And the last thing is that there's another function inside of your app called validate command, where this will be called once on each command that is in any menu item, and it gives you a chance to enable or disable the whole menu item, or in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to set the command state. This gets called for every menu item when the user actually clicks on a menu. So it's going to get called, and you get a chance right before the menu item appears to set up the state of what it should look like. So here we're doing the same thing where we're looking at that sort mode, or we're looking at the property list to create a sort mode. And then I'm setting the command state based off of whether it actually is the currently selected one. And then I set it to be on or off. And there's even a mixed option where you can set it as a little line. So if you have a submenu, if some of the things in there are on and some are off, you can set it to mixed. So another kind of menu that you can do is a contextual menu. So these are screenshots from my app where I'm using context menu interaction. This is kind of like the replacement of the 3D Touch peek and pop that's already on iPhones. You can actually provide a preview view controller that will appear on iPhone and iPad, but you also give it a list of actions, and that list of actions will be used if you right-click on that thing on the Mac. And you can add submenus in here. And so in this case, I've used that target environment Mac Catalyst to add different options into the Mac version of this menu. It doesn't make sense on an iPhone to show open in a separate window, so that will only appear on the Mac version. Toolbars are another thing that are different. And they can actually be surprisingly frustrating to work with. You actually get a little bit of you actually get a little bit of AppKit to work with here. They expose a few parts of AppKit, but not all of it. So it's a little bit weird because some properties, I think I said that on the next slide, but some properties are available on these. If you look at the APIs, some of the properties for them are available and some of them aren't. You really should use toolbars, even though they're a little bit difficult to work with, because it really looks out of place. If you're using especially if you're using a tab bar controller, it looks out of place to have all of those options at the bottom of the screen like you would on an iPad or iPhone app, and they don't map automatically. So you might want to switch over to using an NS toolbar, which you can access using a window scene. So to use the NS toolbar, that means that you have to switch over to using at least window scene and scene session. So dynamic toolbars are really hard to make with this. that was something that I felt with menus was it was a different way of thinking about it. We're used to, for a UI toolbar, we're used to assigning them based off of the view controller that's on the screen. And the things that are going to be on that toolbar will be different depending on what screen you're looking at. On the Mac, that's not really the case. When the window shows up, that's when you should set the toolbar items. And they probably shouldn't change even as the content of the window changes. They can be enabled or disabled, but it's a lot more complicated to switch them out and change the items manually. But on the flip side, NS Toolbar gives you a lot of extra flexibility because it lets the user right-click and choose Customize. And then they can drag out items they don't use very often, add ones they do use often but aren't default, or reorganize things. For actually creating those toolbar items, like I said, not all the properties of NS Toolbar and Toolbar Item are available. Not even all of the initializers are available. So to help you out with that, they actually give you a convenience initializer to use with UI bar button item. So if you have any toolbar items already, you can just use this initializer and pass in the bar button item, and it will show up as a toolbar item with the same text or image and action, just set up for you. Okay, so after you've made a Catalyst app, there's a few different ways you can distribute it. On iOS, we mostly just use the App Store, but that's not the case on the Mac. You can use the App Store, and the process for submitting it to Apple is the same. You can distribute it through the App Store that way. But one thing to keep in mind about that is that because you have a different bundle identifier, all of your purchases are separate. So if you want to have an in-app purchase or a subscription that will apply to a Mac and an iPad version of an app, you actually have to keep track of their purchase yourself using your own servers or however you want to do it to make sure that you can apply that purchase on the other platform. Apple doesn't do it for you. Or you could just distribute the app on your own. And you can host it on your own site, sell it on your own store. But what you should do is notarize it. So Apple, I think they require it now. Well, they like to require it, that you notarize your Mac apps through Xcode. So if you haven't seen this before, what that looks like is it's very similar to submitting your app to the App Store. You do it right inside of Xcode, and you can upload your app to Apple, and then Apple will scan it for malware, and after a few minutes, they'll send you back a notarized version of that app that you can distribute. And if you don't notarize your app, that's when you get those pop-ups that everyone has probably seen when you open an app and says, like, this app is from an unidentified developer. So if you notarize your app, that is how Apple will check to make sure that the app that you've opened on your computer is the same as what Apple uploaded to them. But one thing that Apple doesn't take care of, even if you use the App Store, is receipt validation. So on iOS, we're used to just installing an app on our phone, and that's it. But on Mac, when you install an app, you actually get a .app file added into your applications folder. And if it's a paid app, somebody could just copy it and send it to their friend, and they could run it. So if you want to make sure that that doesn't work, you're going to have to check the App Store receipt yourself every time you launch and prevent it from launching if it's not validated correctly. And doing that, though, is the same as how it is on iOS. Yeah, so this was kind of a combination of, like, there's a couple different talks that Apple gave at WWDC that explains a lot about how to use Catalyst. So I kind of like condensed some of those things in here and also some of the things that I've learned. And this, if you're really interested in using Catalyst, this page is extremely helpful because it has everything that you would need to know. It's just all there. How to use toolbars, how to get them from the Windows scene, how to use the touch bar. It's really helpful. And if you just search for Catalyst Guide or Ultimate Catalyst Guide, this will show up, and it'll definitely help out a lot while you are working on a Catalyst version of your app. So thanks. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Can you use Swift UI for the menu?
For the menu, That's a good question. I haven't tried it with the menus yet because I haven't gone through very much of using SwiftUI yet. I know you can use SwiftUI. I mean, you can use SwiftUI to just make a Mac or iPad app, but if you want, you can if you've made an iPad app using SwiftUI, you can use Catalyst along with that too. So you've got a couple different options. I don't know how it works with using the menus. I'd guess probably not. I'd guess you'd probably still have to build the menu or that way, the same way as we had before. Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of questions from the chat.
Oh, cool.
One was, what happens if you try to call ARKit or some other unsupported API?
Oh, that's a good question.
Does it crash the app?
Yeah, so the question was, what happens if you try to call into ARKit or some other unsupported framework on the Mac? So it doesn't crash, and that's because you actually can't import it. The platforms just aren't available. So if you try to build it, that's one of those things that might give you an error when you just check the box that says Mac and you try to run your app. You might find you're importing some frameworks that just aren't supported. And so to fix that, you can use the target environment Mac Catalyst to only import those frameworks on platforms where they're available. And you can even just use like if can import ARKit. And then if it's available, it'll be imported. And if not, it won't. So it won't crash because you won't even be able to get to run it at that point if you can't use it yet.
There was one more question from the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be easy to spoof the notarization headers?
I'm not sure. I haven't entirely looked into exactly how they handle that. All I know is that Apple says that. I didn't repeat the question. Would it be easy to spoof the notarization headers? All I know is that Apple says that what they do during notarization is equivalent to what the security checks that they do when you upload an app to the App Store. So they're just trying to give you the same kind of security for App Store apps as they do for non-App Store apps. So I don't know if that's if you could spoof it that way. Maybe it might be similar to whether or not you could use that to do it for a Mac App Store app. If like it would be probably pretty similar to that. So I'm not sure. All right. Well, thank you.